Well, it's a complicated story. So when I was a teenager, I was interested in physics, and I became a pro before too very long, and I worked on quantum field theory and general relativity, basically, particle physics and cosmology and so on. And that was in the late 1970s. And at that time, I wasn't in the let's find a theory of everything. I was in, we have some theories. They're starting to actually work. Things like QCD, things about the early universe and cosmology and so on. Let's figure out the consequences of these theories. And that was a fertile thing at that time. And it was, I managed to make some progress on that. Then I got, I was making computational tools that I used. I don't know why other people didn't use them, but at least at the time, there were these computational tools for doing calculations in mathematical physics and so on. I used these to great effect. Then 1979, I kind of realized I had outgrown all existing computational tools, and, next step was build my own. So I started doing that, and that led to this thing called SMP, which was kind of a forerunner of Mathematica and Wolfram Language. And in building SMP, I kind of was I want to make this computational system. Think about it like a natural scientist. What are the kind of primitives of computation from which we can build this? And so I did that, built the system, practical system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then I got back into doing basic science. This is probably 1981 or so. I had this, this basic question about sort of where does complexity come from in the universe? And that the sort of the standard mathematical physics that I knew didn't tell me much about that. Well, I realize, and this is sort of back projecting history, because at the time I wouldn't have explained it this way, but the thing I realize now is that the experience of building this computational language, SMP, back then, from sort of these abstract computational primitives, kind of gave me the meta idea that you could just sort of construct a theory from nothing, so to speak, that you could construct a theory sort of from the ground up, rather than doing what one traditionally does in natural science, which is just to say, look at the universe as it is and try and say, how does one reverse engineer the universe as it is? So that kind of experience of building this computational system from sort of abstract primitives was the thing that kind of got me into this idea of let's see what happens when we just start from some abstract primitives and build things from there. What do we get? Do we get something that's like the natural world? Do we get something completely different? And then the big kind of set of discoveries that I made about these things called cellular automata that are just, simple rules applied to grid, the lines of black and white squares and so on. The big surprise was if you just do the computer experiments, you just sort of turn your computational telescope out into the computational universe, you discover some remarkable phenomena. Particularly, you discover that even when the rules are very simple, the behavior is complicated. And so that, to me, at first, that was a story of the explaining things in the natural world. How does one explain sort of the complexity of snowflakes or of turbulence in fluid flow? What are the underlying sort of foundational ideas, the kind of sort of pre-physics, sort of abstract ideas that lead to this? It's not traditional mathematics. It's not traditional mathematical physics. It's something different. I realized, was this kind of computational foundation. So I worked on that for a number of years. Then I had a sort of attempt to build what ends up getting called complexity theory as a sort of as an actual activity in the world. And the process of doing that convinced me, okay, plan B is just figure out a bunch of stuff myself. Let's not wait for the rest of the world to do this. Let's just figure it out myself. And that led me to start building Mathematica and Wolfram Language and our company. And also, in the end, this big book, A New Kind of Science, that I would now describe as being, at its heart, it's a work of ruleology. It's given these rules, what happens in the world? And the big surprise there was that sort of given these rules, given very simple rules, there was just a lot of richness in what happened and a lot of general principles like the idea of computational irreducibility, the principle of computational equivalence, and so on, these kind of emergent general principles that I kind of realized were there from having done this kind of essentially, natural history study of ruleology, of kind of what do rules out there in the computational universe do. Anyway, the one of the use cases for this kind of new kind of science based on sort of thinking about things computationally, one of the use cases that I couldn't avoid looking at was fundamental physics, because after all, I knew a bunch about fundamental physics. And the obvious question was, you can see that from such a simple rule, you can get all this complicated behavior. So now the question is, well, what about the universe? That's our sort of biggest example of sort of complicated behavior. Could it too be the result of some very simple rule? Well, the first thing I knew was that cellular automata weren't going to do it. That was what we know from relativity about the structure of space and time and so on. Cellular automata say, let's start off assuming we know that sort of things are laid out in space in a particular way, that they sort of update in time in a particular way. We've already locked in the structure of space and time as this kind of grid, and that's not how the universe actually works. Actually, I recently learned that back in the early part of the 20th century, well, I knew that many physicists believed that, for example, space was discrete at that time, but I think Heisenberg in particular had a model of kind of discrete cells in space that's very much like a cellular automaton model, and he didn't manage to make it work. And the fact that he didn't had some interesting historical consequences. But I didn't even know that had been done by him at that time. But anyway, that wasn't going to work. So early 1990s, I'm sort of thinking about this kind of thing. And the big idea at that time was the realization that a network is a much more flexible structure from which you can potentially build space than this sort of fixed grid. So that sort of a technical thing, it's like you imagine that space is made of just discrete points, and the only thing those points sort of have to say for themselves is how they're related to other points. So you're building up this kind of network of relations. And then the result that I knew by the mid-1990s was much like when you look at a fluid with a bunch of molecules bouncing around, what emerges from that molecular dynamics on a large scale is fluid dynamics, is kind of the large-scale features of fluids. I knew that what emerged from sort of the small scale of this network and updates in the network and so on, what would emerge on a large scale with all sorts of sort of footnotes was general relativity, the structure of space and time as we are familiar with it from 20th century physics. So that was kind of exciting. I didn't figure out quantum mechanics at that time. I had ideas about it. I was frankly prejudiced from my own sort of desire, I suppose, to believe that sort of the progress of history is somehow unique, and that there wasn't, that there weren't lots of copies of us all over the place doing different kinds of things, and I didn't really see how that worked. So then it was sort of my friends in physics at that time were like, we hate the fact that you're going after this completely different idea about how fundamental physics might work from the mathematical physics that we've all been doing for the last, 50 or 100 years. And so I was like, okay, fine. The market doesn't want this. I'm going to go off and do other things. So I worked on Wolfram Alpha and computational language and all sorts of things like that. 2018, I guess, I kept on coming back to thinking about this kind of, what could one make progress with in fundamental physics? The thing that then happened was I sort of realized that there was some things I didn't like that were kind of arbitrary in the way that I'd set up these networks and things. I made some progress thinking about hypergraphs instead of ordinary graphs and so on. That helped sort of unlock various technical aspects of things. Then 2019, a couple of young physicists who knew about what I'd been doing were like, you can't just leave this project undone. You've got to go forward and actually do something with this. And so that led to something that went vastly more quickly than I expected in 2019 of building up our physics project and actually understanding about how quantum mechanics works. And turned out the thing that I was afraid of doesn't actually happen for reasons that I did not previously foresee. But okay, so how does it work? This is a long tangled tale. I mean, the sort of big, the next big sort of injection of kind of confidence building was the fact that we seem to be able to reproduce the main features of 20th century physics from this underlying completely abstract infrastructure. But then there was still a problem, because the problem was, I thought at first we're searching for the fundamental rule, the fundamental computational rule from which our universe comes. But that always bothered me, because it's like we get to that, it's kind of the end of Copernicanism in some sense. We keep on being told we're not special. Our planet isn't the center of the universe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So then if we find this rule, and it's one particular rule, we can hold it in our hands, and maybe it's a rule that seems to us simple, why did we get the simple rule universe and not some completely different universe? So that really bothered me for a long time. And as is usually the case with these kinds of things, that, it's like, I don't know how I'll explain that. It's kind of like when Newton was doing sort of celestial mechanics, was saying, well, once the planets are set in motion, I can work out what happened. But, how did they get into their initial configuration? That's the work of God, so to speak, was what he said at that time. Same with Darwin, trying to figure out, sort of the natural selection, but how did the first life come about? In both of these cases, what we know from sort of the long run of history is that sort of it was a thing from outside the systems that they were thinking about that led people after them to be able to understand, how could a solar system form, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in this case, the thing that we realized was that this idea that you're searching for the rule, and then you have to say, well, why this rule and not another? It's just not the right question. What's really going on, I think, is that all possible rules are being run. Now, we had a big tip-off to this, because in this network, and the network is continually getting rewritten, and you're getting a new network at every moment in time, there are many different ways that rewriting can happen. And that leads to many different paths of history, where you've got this network, it can be rewritten one way, it can be rewritten another way, those are two different branches. After a while, the ways that it can get rewritten may end up with the exact same network. Two different branches may end up producing the same network. So then you have a merge in this thing we call a multi-way graph, which is this kind of graph of the possible histories of the universe. Not possible, the graph of histories of the universe. And so the first big tip-off is that we're not looking for the history of the universe. We're looking for this graph of these different histories of the universe. And in some sense, this sort of I suppose, ontological sort of view of this is they're all happening. It's not that we picked a particular one, they're all happening. And then the realization is that as observers of the universe, our minds are also doing this kind of branching and merging that the rest of the universe is doing. So this kind of, how do we perceive the universe? It's the story of how does a branching and merging mind perceive a branching and merging universe? And that story ends up essentially being the story of quantum mechanics. And it's so kind of this idea that we are an extended thing with respect to what we call branchial space, the space of possible branches of history. So that was kind of the realization there. Then we realized, well, but you can take this even further. Rather than taking a particular rule and applying it in all possible ways, let's just consider all possible rules. Now the question is, so how do we perceive the thing you get from studying sort of the evolution of all possible rules? You might say, how can you say anything definite from a thing where all possible rules are happening? Well, it is in fact a very rigid structure. You might think it's a big floppy thing because everything can, sort of in some sense, everything can happen, but there is a dynamics to it. It's not as if everything can sort of happen all at once. It's that there is, this thing happens, then that thing happens. There is a chain of causality about what happens. And yes, it's sort of all possible chains can be followed, but there's still a sort of a very rigid structure to this whole system. And so then and that thing, that sort of entangled limit of all possible computations is what we call the Ruliad. And so now the point is that what one has to think about is, if that's what there is, in some sense, what do we perceive about what there is? Because we are part of the Ruliad. So the question of what we perceive about the universe is a question of how there's a certain kind of observer of the Ruliad. We're not observing the whole Ruliad. We are observing some tiny little piece of the Ruliad. It's very much like in physical space. We're sitting on this particular planet, in this particular corner of some particular galaxy. And so our perception of the universe is based on that particularity of where we are. And there isn't really a theory of where we are. We are where we are. We can go and trace back and say, well, our galaxy evolved in this or that way. But, once we know where we are, so to speak, then we have a certain perception of the universe. And the point is, the realization is, it's the same story with the Ruliad. That is, we as observers are we are taking a particular tiny slice of the Ruliad. Now, the big question is, so can we say anything sort of scientifically based on this? And the thing that I realized is that the key observation is that it depends on what kind of an observer you are. If you were an observer outside the Ruliad, observing the Ruliad from the outside, if you could do that, you would have some conclusion about how complicated the universe is. But actually, we're observers with some very particular characteristics. For example, we are computationally bounded. Our minds are we have finite number of neurons, 100 billion neurons, whatever it is. We're bounded in the computations we can do. And we already know, I've studied a bunch, the second law of thermodynamics, law of entropy increase, and so on. And that's a case where what we observe is that all those molecules bouncing around, they seem to us random in the motions that they have. Now, if we were to trace molecule by molecule and trace all the computations about how all the molecules interact, we would say they're not random. They follow very particular rules, and we can work out what they are. We can work out what the molecules will do. But the point is that as computationally bounded observers, we can't do that. So we kind of have to throw up our hands and say, it looks random to us. And that's sort of an example of how being an observer of the kind that we are necessarily leads us to certain conclusions about the way the world is. That is, we believe in the second law of thermodynamics because we are computationally bounded observers observing this kind of irreducible computation of these molecules bouncing around. And so that then leads us to the question of, well, given certain assumptions about us as observers, what does that mean about the physics we can perceive? And I think there are two key sort of features of us as observers, although I think there are other ones that seem so obvious that they've never really been called out as assumptions about how the world works. But the two that I think are critical for 20th century physics, at least, one is that we're computationally bounded, and the other is that we believe we are persistent in time. So it is not self-evident that we believe that there is a consistent thread of us that goes through time, even though in this model of physics, at every moment we're made of different atoms of space and so on. Even despite that, we believe that we persistently exist through time. Well, it turns out that those two assumptions, computational boundedness and persistence through time, those two assumptions with the mathematical structure of the Ruliad are sufficient to give us the three fundamental theories of 20th century physics, which to me is completely remarkable, because the fact that it is possible to derive laws of physics is something that is, at some level, very surprising. I mean, the three kind of fundamental laws that we're talking about that are the cornerstones of 20th century physics are statistical mechanics, where the main event is the second law of thermodynamics, general relativity, theory of space-time, and quantum mechanics. And what has been believed in the past, what was believed from the 1860s on, is that, look, statistical mechanics, the second law of thermodynamics, should be derivable in some way from the laws of mechanics. Once you know how all these molecules bounce around, it should just be a matter of pure mathematical derivation to show that they satisfy the second law. Nobody's succeeded in showing how that works. In the end, I think the reason is that to understand it requires understanding about observers and computational irreducibility and computational boundedness and so on, which is a rather different kind of set of concepts than people were pursuing in mathematical physics. But the thing that is then very surprising is general relativity and quantum mechanics. Both of these were seen by me, as well as everybody else, as kind of wheel-in features of the universe. That is, we could have had a universe that has general relativity. We could have had a universe that doesn't have general relativity. Likewise, quantum mechanics. But what seems to be the case is that for observers like us, it is inevitable that what we perceive must be a universe which has those particular laws. So now you ask, well, what's the foundation of that? I mean, the Ruliad, in some sense, it's a necessary object. It's not an object that is like, well, it happens to be this way. It is sort of as necessary as the fact that 2 + 2 = 4, given our definition of what 2 is and what plus is and so on. That's not something we can wiggle out of. That's not something we can say, well, on Mars, 2 + 2 might not be equal to 4. Given our definitions, it is inevitable. And so similarly with the Ruliad, given the kind of the concept of computation, the abstract concept of computation, the Ruliad is a necessary object. Strangely, it's an object, and it surprises me as well as other people, that it hadn't been studied before. It's an object that, in some sense, is an obvious object to consider. I think the reason it wasn't studied, certainly the reason I hadn't studied it, is because, in a sense, computation, well, in my lifetime, computation has been gone from being super valuable to being somewhat everyday. But the profligate wasting of computation done by the universe is something that it took me a while to kind of come to terms with. That is that there could be, all of this computation happening that is all irrelevant that's all way below anything that we perceive. And that was and that there are all these different branches of history and different rules being followed and so on. And that sort of the universe is just doing all this computation was something that seems, it felt like, well, actually we should concentrate on the particular computation that we care about. But in any case, I think I think you're right that the Ruliad is sort of in its origins is not a reverse engineering natural science effort. It is a bottom-up effort of, this is an abstract object. Does it now relate to what we see in the world? And as I say, in my personal history, the fact that I ended up thinking about science in those terms is a consequence of the pure coincidence that I worked on sort of building computational tools for which I had to think about things sort of from the bottom up. After I happened to learn about a bunch of things about sort of top-down natural science. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was wonderful. My hope, and I'll give you a break now. My hope with this time is to get pretty deep into Ruliology, which is a new word for me. You've already taken us there and presaged a lot of the things that I wanted to discuss. Before I go on, though, maybe I ought to I have this quote here. It's basically a slogan, just to get maybe a sort of definition of the Ruliad on the board for our listeners. And so
Absolutely.
You wrote that the Ruliad may be defined as the entangled limit of everything that is computationally possible, i.e., the result of following all possible computational rules in all possible ways. But now, returning to what you were saying, I'm not a philosopher of science, but like most people, I've read The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Kuhn a number of times. And what really struck me about what you were saying is how closely this story sort of mirrors his picture of revolutions in some ways. So you started out working in normal science, so to speak. We already had these established programs, general relativity and quantum field theory. And my understanding is that this is really where some of the other theories of everything emerged from. So string theory comes out of modeling the strong force, so on and so forth. But then, and then the path integral.
I just looked at this again when we were working on the physics project, and I was kind of trying to explain its background.
Comes along,
it was a review of a new kind of science in the New York Times.
In these theories,
it was actually a very well written review and a sensible review.
Throw it
by
all away,
a journalist,
and I think your words were you realized
I hadn't
that
looked
you
at
could
this for 20 years, and I'd completely forgotten what was in it. But
this is
the thing
the
that,
revolutionary
and at the time,
effort. And
I was like,
the normal
why would my friends, the
do not
physicists,
like this?
They might not care about what I'm doing.
Put it, like a lot of people,
why would there be any kind
hated
of
that you were
negativity
going
about
off
it?
and doing
and then I'm looking back 20 years later at this cartoon.
Way. I don't know. I have the book
realizing
on my
that from the outside, from the
I don't
point
know
of view
if
of
it
this
was in a
journalist
project
writing
to find the
this
fundamental
review,
theory of physics, or
it seemed obvious
it was
to
in
him
one of your
that
posts
what this was,
your website.
as
but
you
there
put
was
it,
this
the dragon,
really funny cartoon where
about
a dragon with
the
cellular automata
sort of
for
mathematical
teeth
physicists
is about to chomp
but
down
I think,
on a physicist who's writing equations
it's
in
a funny
blackboard.
thing because, for example, our physics project and now what's led to the Ruliad and so on, there are a whole series of sort of personal, circumstances that led to that path being a possible path. Any one of which, had they not been there, that path simply wouldn't have happened. And, the fact that I've sort of alternated between doing basic science and doing technology development, the technology development drives this desire to kind of understand computation at a fundamental level for practical reasons. It's a somewhat strange kind of set of circumstances. And I think you're right that the traditional, physics went through a big kind of transformation in the early part of the 20th century. And that transformation was a lot of paradigmatic change. After that time, there wasn't a lot of paradigmatic change. There was a lot of difficult technical work, but it was within that established paradigm. And it's, I think the fact that we have my own efforts, had somebody said to me when I was in the middle of doing these things, are you sort of purposefully inventing a new paradigm? I would have said, absolutely not. I'm just, pursuing things using methods and techniques that I understand. What happened as I was writing my book, A New Kind of Science, I did realize somewhere in the middle of that, gosh, this is a different approach to science. That actually wasn't my, initial take on things. But that was, in a sense, what I realized was that in the sort of the long view of sort of history of science, there'd been a long period starting in the 1600s when mathematics and sort of things like calculus were the dominant way of explaining things in nature. I mean, there had been methods from antiquity just saying this is what things are made of. But then we had the sort of mathematicization of exact science. And the question was, well, is there more, so to speak? And this was a realization, yes, there is more. And in a sense, it was a thing that was obvious given the ambient technology of our time, namely, computation, that doing mathematics, it's sort of ironic that I've, spent lots of effort sort of making mathematics doable by computer. And yet, in a sense, the bigger picture is the computation, not sort of this specific corner of it that ends up being the mathematics that we've currently done.